They say iron is cold and heartless. But tonight, the rust is bleeding, and a silent protector is the only thing standing between a runaway steel ghost and a valley full of sleeping souls. In a world of steam and thunder, the smallest heart can stop the heaviest engine. The Lonely Watchman. The Great Divide was a jagged scar of rock and pine, a place where the wind howled like a wounded wolf. For most, the mountain pass was a terrifying obstacle, a frozen labyrinth that claimed the unwary. But for old Rusty, it was more than a territory, it was a home defined by the smell of pine needles and the sharp, metallic tang of the rails. He was a massive, shaggy Great Pyrenees, his fur a matted shield against the elements, blending perfectly with the winter clouds that clung to the peaks. He lived at the mouth of Tunnel 86, a dark, cavernous throat cut into the granite nearly a century ago. He had no master to call his name, no collar to mark his neck, and no warm hearth to curl beside when the temperature plummeted. He belonged to the mountain itself, a sovereign of the high altitudes who moved with a slow, deliberate grace. To the rare hiker, he was a myth; to the mountain goats, he was a silent peer who shared the narrow ledges. For years, Rusty had patrolled the iron rails, his sensitive ears tuned to the hum of the tracks long before the lights appeared. He understood the language of the steel, the way it sang when a heavy load was approaching and the way it groaned under the weight of the coal cars. He knew the schedule of every freight train better than the dispatchers in the city, sensing the vibrations through the very pads of his paws. He was the mountain's unofficial clock, a witness to the relentless march of industry. To the engineers, Rusty was a white blur in the periphery, a flickering ghost seen through a rain-streaked windshield. They would catch glimpses of his golden eyes reflecting the locomotive's glare, a solemn guardian watching them pass. With a quiet, regal dignity. Some would toss a sandwich or a biscuit out the window as they roared by, a small tribute to the creature that seemed to haunt the lonely pass. He never chased the trains, he simply observed them, a silent witness to the thunder. Deep down, Rusty was a creature of ancient instincts, a breed designed to protect the flock from the shadows. Here, there were no sheep to guard, so he had adopted the mountain and the iron veins that ran through it. He felt a strange responsibility for the rhythmic life of the pass. Every night, he did his rounds, checking the perimeters of the tunnel and the stability of the slopes, ensuring that his domain remained undisturbed by the chaos of the world below. As the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow, Rusty took his position on the overlook. Below him, the lights of the valley began to flicker on, tiny sparks of human life nestled in the cradle of the forest. He sat perfectly still, a statue of fur and grit, sensing the change in the air. The atmosphere was growing heavy, the barometric pressure dropping like a stone. A storm was coming, one that would test the strength of the mountain and the heart of its guardian. The bitter bite. The storm arrived at 11 p.m. like an invading army, sweeping across the divide with a ferocity that silenced the woods. It wasn't just snow, it was an ice blizzard, a silver thaw that coated every branch, stone, and rail in a thick, suffocating layer of glass. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed, tearing at the trees and turning the air into a blinding fog of white crystals. Visibility vanished, and the world became a monochromatic nightmare of cold and noise. On the steep grade leading down toward the village of Oakhaven, the tracks began to glaze over, becoming a treacherous slide. This section of the line was the most dangerous in the state, a winding path that dropped thousands of feet over a few miles. Under the ice, the friction that trains relied on to stay in control was evaporating. The mountain was transforming from a corridor of transport into a slide of certain death, and the village below lay directly in its path. Inside the cab of engine for 09, a massive freight locomotive hauling 60 cars of heavy timber, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The heater was struggling against the chill seeping through the glass, and the controls felt sluggish. Leo, a young engineer with less than a year on the mountain run, gripped the throttle with white knuckles. Beside him, his veteran conductor was checking the gauges, his face etched with a sudden, sharp concern as a warning light flickered red. The disaster began with a sound like a gunshot, the snap of a primary hydraulic line deep within the engine's belly. The extreme cold had made the fluid viscous and the seals brittle, and under the pressure of the descent, the system finally surrendered. Within seconds, the primary braking system went dead. Leo pulled the emergency handle, but it moved with a sickening, weightless ease. The connection was gone, and the heavy train was now at the mercy of gravity. We're a runaway. Leo shouted into his radio, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. We've lost the brakes on the 409. We're heading for the Oakhaven curve, and we're picking up speed. He tried to engage the dynamic brakes, but the ice on the rails caused the wheels to slip and spin, providing no resistance. The train was a 100-ton steel ghost, accelerating into the darkness with a terrifying, silent momentum that mocked the engineer's efforts. He reached for the radio again, desperate to warn the station in the valley to evacuate the town, but the speaker only emitted a mocking hiss of static. The storm had done its work well, toppling a repeater tower 3 miles back. They were isolated, hurtling toward a sharp bend that would surely derail the train and send 60 cars of timber crashing into the heart of the sleeping village. They were alone in the dark, and the end was coming at 80 miles per hour. Warning sign hashed the shiver in the tracks. A mile ahead, old Rusty was huddled in a shallow cave, his thick coat providing the only warmth in a world of ice. He was accustomed to the cold, but this storm felt different. It felt malicious. Suddenly, he stood up, his hackles rising. He didn't hear the train yet, as the wind was blowing the sound away, but he felt it. Through the frozen ground and the very stones of his shelter, a terrifying message was being sent. The mountain was trembling. He stepped out into the blizzard, his paws sinking deep into the fresh drifts. He pressed his ear to the cold iron of the rail, and the vibration he felt made him recoil. It wasn't the steady, rhythmic thrum of a controlled descent that he had heard 1,000 times before. It was a frantic, high-pitched screeching of metal, a chaotic frequency that signaled a machine out of control. The iron beast was no longer walking, it was screaming in terror. The dog looked down the mountain toward the valley. The lights of Oakhaven were distant and fragile, flickering like birthday candles in the storm. People were in their beds, children were dreaming, and none of them knew that a mountain of steel and wood was falling toward them. Rusty knew the geography of the tracks perfectly. He knew the Dead Man's Curve just past Tunnel 86, where the rails hugged a sheer cliff with a 300-foot drop. If the train reached that curve at its current speed, it wouldn't make the turn. It would leap from the tracks, a projectile of fire and metal that would level everything in its path. Rusty's instinct, honed by generations of guardians, flared to life. He didn't flee for the safety of the deep woods, nor did he hide in his cave. Instead, he began to trot toward the tracks, his heavy paws finding purchase on the ice-covered gravel of the railbed. He took his stand directly in the center of the line, facing the direction of the oncoming roar. The wind tried to knock him over, and the ice pelted his eyes, but he planted his feet firmly between the ties. He was a creature of the wild, yet he felt a profound connection to the people in the valley he had watched from afar. He was the only thing standing between the sleeping village and the runaway ghost. As the roar grew louder, a low-frequency rumble that shook the very trees, Rusty let out a howl. It wasn't a cry of fear, but a challenge to the storm and the machine. He was a white speck in a world of grey and black, a tiny heart beating against the cold indifference of gravity. He waited for the light to appear, his golden eyes fixed on the mouth of the tunnel where the nightmare would soon emerge. The signal in the dark. The headlight of engine for 09 finally burst through the snow, a blinding, wobbling eye of white light that cut through the blizzard. Inside the cab, Leo was shielding his eyes, trying to see anything through the wall of white. The speed was terrifying now, the trees were passing in a blur, and the cabin was shaking so violently that he could barely stay in his seat. He saw the mouth of Tunnel 86 approaching and knew that the curve was only seconds away. Suddenly, Leo saw something impossible. Directly in the path of the train, illuminated by the high beams, stood a massive white shape. "Get out of the way," he screamed at the windshield, his voice lost in the roar of the engine. He slammed on the horn, a desperate, mournful blast that echoed through the canyon, but the figure remained stationary. It looked like a polar bear carved from the mountain itself, unmoving and resolute. As the train bore down on him, Rusty didn't flinch. He began to bark, a deep, rhythmic boom that was felt more than heard. It was a signal, a desperate attempt to communicate the gravity of the situation. At the very last possible second, as the cowcatcher was about to sweep him under, Rusty veered off. He didn't run away, he leaped onto a high, icy ledge that overlooked a critical piece of equipment, the manual track switch. This switch was an old relic, a bypass used only for emergencies. It led to the Runaway sand pit, a steep uphill side track designed specifically to stop runaway trains by using gravity and deep sand to sap their momentum. Leo saw the dog hovering near the iron lever and realized what the animal was doing. The sand pit! Leo gasped, his heart leaping. If we hit that switch, we stop. But it's a manual throw, I can't get to it. The engineer looked out the side window as they thundered past the switch. He saw the dog standing by the iron handle, which was encased in a thick, translucent shell of ice. The lever was locked in the mainline up position. To move it, someone, or something, would have to break the ice and pull the heavy iron bar with immense force. It was a task for two grown men with crowbars, not a solitary animal in a blizzard. As the locomotive cleared the switch, Leo looked back through the rearview mirror. He saw the white ghost of the mountain lunge toward the lever. The train was still accelerating, the cars of timber swaying dangerously behind the engine. The fate of Oakhaven now rested on a rusted piece of iron and the jaws of a dog that refused to let the world break. The broken lever. Old Rusty didn't hesitate. He knew the purpose of the iron stick, he had seen the men in orange vests work it during the summer months. He lunged at the lever, his teeth catching on the frozen metal. The ice was thick and bitter, tasting of salt and ancient rust. He pulled with every ounce of strength in his massive frame, his muscles bunching under his thick fur. The lever didn't budge. It was a frozen sentinel, refusing to yield to the beast. He tried again, this time throwing his entire body weight backward. His paws slipped on the icy rocks, his claws scratching uselessly against the glass-like surface. He fell, tumbling into a snowbank, but he scrambled up instantly. The first few cars of the train had already passed the junction, he only had seconds before the entire length of the train passed the point of no return. If the switch wasn't thrown now, the rear cars would pull the engine back onto the main line, or worse, cause a catastrophic derailment at the junction. Rusty growled, a primal sound of fury. He ignored the pain in his gums as the frozen iron tore at his mouth, and the blood began to stain the white snow. He lunged one final time, not just pulling, but twisting his body with a desperate, violent wrench. He put his life into the movement, his heart straining against his ribs. Under the immense pressure, the structural integrity of the ice finally failed. With a sound like a rifle shot, the ice shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. The iron lever groaned, resisting for a heartbeat, and then finally swung forward. It locked into the bypass position with a heavy, metallic thud that vibrated through Rusty's jaw. He fell back, exhausted, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he kept his eyes on the tracks. He had done his part, the mountain was now reconfigured. The wheels of the 20th car hit the switch. Instead of following the engine toward the cliff, the car was diverted onto the steep incline of the sandpit. The sudden change in direction caused a violent jerk that traveled up the length of the train. Steel screeched against steel as the flanges of the wheels fought the new geometry, but the switch held. The train was no longer headed for Oakhaven, it was headed into the sky. Rusty watched as the tail lights of the last car disappeared up the emergency track, disappearing into the swirling white abyss. The roar of the engine changed from a predatory growl to a struggling whine as it fought the sudden uphill grade. The dog lay in the snow, his mouth bleeding and his body trembling from the exertion, watching the red lights fade. He had turned the tide of the iron ghost. Cloud with tornado hashed the ride into the mist. The train hit the sand pit with the force of a tidal wave. The deep, heavy sand exploded around the wheels, creating a desert storm in the middle of a blizzard. Engine 409 groaned as the gravity of the steep incline began to claw at its momentum. Leo felt the deceleration, a brutal, bone-jarring force that threw him against the control panel. He grabbed the seat, watching the speedometer needle finally begin its slow crawl back toward zero. Slowly, painfully, the iron beast began to lose its fight. The 60 cars of timber, once a weapon of destruction, now acted as an anchor, dragging the engine to a halt. With one final, shuddering gasp of steam, the 409 stopped. It sat halfway up the emergency slope, buried to its axles in sand and snow. Leo sat in the silence of the cab, the only sound the ticking of the cooling metal and the distant howl of the wind. He stumbled out of the cab, his boot sinking into the sand. He looked back down the incline toward the switch, his flashlight beam struggling to penetrate the storm. He was alive. Oakhaven was safe. "Hey! Dog," he called out into the darkness, his voice cracking with emotion. "Where are you? You did it! You saved us all!" He began to trek back down the tracks, desperate to find the creature that had performed the miracle. By the time Leo reached the switch, the blizzard was already beginning to bury the evidence. He found the shattered ice and the iron lever moved to the bypass position. He saw the deep gouges in the frozen earth where the dog's paws had struggled for grip. And he saw the blood, bright red spots on the pristine white snow, a testament to the price the protector had paid. But the dog was nowhere to be found. Old Rusty had already retreated into the shadows. He didn't want the praise of men or the warmth of their cabins. He had fulfilled his ancient oath to the mountain. He moved slowly through the trees, his body aching, his mouth stinging from the cold. He found his way back to the mouth of Tunnel 86, curling into the deepest corner of his cave. He licked his wounds, the heat of his own body slowly returning as he drifted into a deep, well-earned sleep. The next morning, rescue crews from Oakhaven reached the train. They spoke of lucky brakes and miraculous mechanical timing, but Leo told a different story. He spent years telling anyone who would listen about the great white ghost of the divide. He left bowls of fresh meat and heavy wool blankets at the switch every winter, and though he never saw the dog again, he knew he was there. Rusty remained the silent sovereign of the rails, a shadow in the snow, watching the world go by. The world thinks it's saved by technology and engineers. But sometimes, the only thing keeping the world on its tracks is a heart that beats for others, hidden under a coat of white fur. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button, subscribe for more legendary tales of silent heroes. We bring the untold stories to life. Comment Iron Heart below if you believe animals are our guardian angels. Which corner of the world are you reading from today? I'm looking for my top fans.